Everybody, thank you very much for coming on a cold and dark January morning. You're very welcome here in the Tortoise Newsroom. Have we got anybody here who has not been in the Tortoise Newsroom before? Ooh, quite a few. You're very welcome. This is a ThinkIn. I am Liz Mosley. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. And there's a few bits of housekeeping before we start. The first thing to say is that we are filming and streaming this session so that people who can't make it and be in the room or who just couldn't bring themselves to get out of bed can watch from home, and also so that we can kind of watch it back and see what we said and use the best bits for our reporting and our journalism. This tortoise here is Agatha, and she is a clock, and she will make her way across the screen, and when she gets to this end, we'll have done an hour. She will wave her flag in the air, and that will mean we have to stop. So that's how we all end up getting to work not too late. And the idea of a ThinkIn is not a panel. It's intentionally a conversation. We've tried to get the best bits of a newspaper editorial conference where a bunch of journalists get into a room with a kind of question or a big story of the day or something that you want to try and figure out and thrash out a point of view between them. This morning is meant to be, obviously, if you don't have just journalists, it's inherently more interesting and useful a conversation than if it is just journalists. This morning will be slightly different because we're joined by Daniel Susskind, who's a fellow in economics at Balliol College, Oxford, has just written this here book on a world without work. And so he has done a sort of, I would say, a sort of slightly more than preliminary thinking on this question for us, so can get us going to a good place quite quickly. But I do want for this to be a conversation with everybody in the room, not just a conversation between Daniel and I. There is one rule of ThinkIns, and that is no questions, because what we don't want is for it to be sort of people waxing lyrical and giving their wise points of view. We really do want to hear what you think, because this is a topic that is an open-ended question. Daniel has a thesis, which I'll ask him to summarise in a second, but we're very, very interested to hear what you think the future of work looks like. Now, I'm perhaps slightly an unusual choice of editor to edit this ThinkIn. It would typically be perhaps Alexi Moshes, who's one of our chief reporters on the world of technology and AI and has been very involved in our work on the Global Artificial Intelligence Index and the story we did on Apple when we first came back from Christmas. But I got picked for this one because last year I edited a series of ThinkIns called The Future of Work with our partner here, Fora, where we talked about all kinds of stuff. How do we create workplaces for cognitive difference? What about mental health in the workplace? All kinds of things to do with kind of working culture, if you like. And the big thing that came out of that series of ThinkIns is another season of ThinkIns, which I'm going to edit for sort of this term, we think of it in terms, which is about the future of learning, which is what should we be learning about, teaching one another, how should that all work? And this conversation this morning is kind of a segue in a way between those two rounds of ThinkIn. And I have a 9-year-old son, my son Sam, and he sometimes, very occasionally, looks up from playing Pokemon and asks me questions about my job. And he said, "What are you doing this week in your job, Mummy at Tortoise?" And I said, "Oh, I'm having a conversation with a man who's written a book about what a world without work would look like." And he sort of pulled a face and said, "Well, isn't the answer just absolutely amazing?" And it turns out the answer isn't just absolutely amazing, but there's elements of optimism as well as part of the story, which I'm happy to say. Just a quick show of hands. Who here feels anxious about the effect that increased automation is going to have on their particular job? Who has anxiety about that? Jack at the back, tell us why you're anxious about it. Jack's one of our reporters here at Tortoise.
I helped draft these notes, but also I was coming in not just to listen to the ThinkIn, but to usefully move the slides around, to show something about being filmed, or to show Daniel's bio, but instead the machine or the computer is doing it on a loop.
So you've been automated out of your job. Thank you very much, Jack. Have a lovely day at home.
Thank you.
Who then, I'm just going to ask the question in a slightly different way. If you don't feel immediate levels of anxiety about automation in your job, do you feel let's say if you had an offspring of some kind, 30 years time from now, and they were doing the job that you currently, would you be worried about their future of work in relation to automation? If they were to go into the same field that you're in, who would feel worried about that? Yes. Hi, what's your name?
George.
Hi, George. What do you do for a living?
Graphic design.
Okay.
And yeah, I feel like there's more and more tools, literally week in, week out, that automate processes that a human takes now quite a long time to do. So you'll still need people, I imagine, for human-centric thinking, but still the practical element is it's easier and easier for machines to do it.
And that's,
literally week in, week out.
It's really interesting that you said graphic design rather than another, more classically, you can automate it, because what we hear a lot is, well, the robots will be able to do everything but not the creative parts. Mm-hmm. But your job is inherently creative, right?
Yeah, I think you'll still need people for sure, but the space in which humans will be needed will shrink.
Okay, interesting. So we have an audience here, Daniel, of not desperately technologically anxious people.
Yes.
Talk to us a bit about sort of the précis of the book, because you start with technological anxiety as a sort of idea, don't you?
Yeah. So every day we hear stories of systems and machines that are taking on tasks we thought only human beings alone could do. Yeah. So whether it's making a medical diagnosis, driving a car, drafting a legal contract, composing, moving music, designing a building, or writing news reports. What does all of this mean for the vast majority of us for whom our job is our only source of income? I think this is one of the biggest questions of our time. And I wrote this book because I don't think we're doing justice to the possibility that there might simply not be enough well-paid work for everyone to do because of the advances of technology. Now, I'm not saying, and if you pick up the book expecting this, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not saying there's going to be some technological big bang in the next few years after which everyone wakes up and finds there's no work for them to do. But what I do think is that as we move through the 21st century, there is a very real risk that more and more people find that they're not able to make the sorts of economic contributions that they might have hoped to make in the 20th century. And I think this is a fundamental challenge to the way that we live together in society at the moment. And I think there are three main challenges that I look at in the book and try and think about how we could solve. One is a challenge of inequality. If we think of the economy as a pie, the traditional way in which we sliced up that pie is through the labor market, paying people for the work that they do. What do we do in a world where that traditional mechanism is less effective than it was in the past? How do we share out prosperity in society? Yeah. That's the first. The second is not really about economics, I don't think. It's about what we do about the growing political power of large technology companies who are increasingly responsible for developing these technologies. I think what's interesting is that in the 20th century, we were particularly concerned with the economic power of large corporations. Are their profits too excessive, and are their prices unreasonable? I think in the 21st century, we're going to be far more concerned with their political power, the impact they have on how we all live together in society. Not prices and profit, but things like liberty and democracy and social justice. And then I think the third challenge is the challenge of meaning and purpose. How do we provide people with a sense of meaning and purpose and direction in life if work no longer sits at the center of their lives? And so these are, I think, the three big challenges that follow from a world with less work. But it is, and you sort of hinted, I mean, the book is fundamentally an optimistic one. And the reason for that, I think, is simple, which is that in the 21st century, technological progress is going to make us more prosperous than ever before. The traditional economic challenge that we've all faced is, again, if we think of the economy as a pie, how to make the pie large enough for everyone to live on. Go back to the turn of the 1st century AD, and if you had taken the global economic pie and divided it into slices for everyone in the world, most people would get a few $100s. Almost everyone for most of human history has lived on or around the poverty line. If you were to roll forward to 1,000 years, roughly the same was true. But in the last few hundred years, as we all know, economic growth has exploded. The global economic pie today, if we were to divide it up into equal slices, is somewhere between something like $11,000 In 30 years, it will be double that. In 60 years, it will be double that again. We have come very close to solving the economic problem that has sort of plagued humankind until now. And so technological unemployment, in a way, will be a symptom of that success. I think that's how I see it, that in the 21st century, we're going to solve one problem, which is how do we make the pie large enough for everyone to live on? But we're going to replace it with these three other ones. The challenge of inequality, how we slice up that pie, the challenge of power, what we do about large companies who are increasingly responsible for developing the technologies that make the pie bigger, and then this challenge of meaning and purpose as well. So that's an outline of the book, the thesis that I'm putting forward.
So we've got inequality, we've got political power of big tech, and we've got meaning and purpose.
Yes.
What will we all be doing, and how will we feel about that? When you say that the technology will make the pie bigger, technology, obviously, when we think of technology now, we think of this and things you can't really see.
Yeah.
But the beginning of the sort of making of the pie bigger was technology. It was a great big giant machine in a building, that kind of technology,
so
and all kinds of medical technology and all of this. Yeah, exactly. So there is a tension, isn't there, that in the end, the technology from the beginning has made the pie bigger, but everybody's worried about it at every stage, that it was going to make everything worse. Yeah. So why is this time different?
Yeah, and so that's where I begin the book, because it's ever since modern economic growth began, somewhere in the 18th century probably, people have worried about technology taking their jobs, the technology of the time, and yet every time, broadly, they've turned out to be wrong. Generally, there's always been enough work for people to do. It's not strictly true. Transitions have been very difficult, and one of the arguments I make in the book is that actually this sort of obsessive focus on the number of jobs is quite unhelpful, because actually what also matters is the quality of the job, the pay of the job, the security of the job, the status of the job, and those things, even though if you look at the unemployment figures over the last few hundred years, relatively low and stable, those things have really varied quite dramatically. So I begin the book by saying, well, why is it that our ancestors have worried about this consistently and turned out every time to be wrong? And then, exactly as you say, why is this time different? And I mean, the short answer is that what's different is that our systems and machines are becoming increasingly capable. We thought there was a sort of refuge of activities that only human beings could ever do. And what we're seeing is that more and more of those activities are being taken on by machines. And I call this task encroachment, that just relentless progress of technology. That the boundaries that we thought existed between what machines could and could not do have turned out to be far less solid than we thought. I mean, the deeper answer is that when you look at the different economic forces that through economic history have tended to increase the demand for the work of human beings, my worry is that because of this relentless process of task encroachment, those forces are going to be weaker in the future. And that's what worries me. And I distinguish between what I call frictional technological unemployment, which is when there is plenty of work for people to do, it's just for a variety of reasons, they're not able to do it. It might be they don't have the right skills, it might be they don't live in the right place, or it might be that they don't feel it's the sort of work for them. I call this a sort of identity mismatch.
Well, give us an example. What sort of thing?
Men of working age in the United States displaced from manufacturing roles. There are some people who say that the reason that some of them haven't gone back into work isn't because they don't have the skills to do the work, and it's not because they don't live in the place where the work's been created. It's that the work that exists isn't the sort of work they want to do. And it's a really unhelpful term. People talk about pink-collar work. But to capture the fact that there are occupations like social work, nursing, caring, and so on, which involve activities which are very hard to automate, but they also tend to be done predominantly by women in the United States. So 97.7% of primary and preschool teachers in the US are women. I think about 85% of social workers, 92% of nurses. And there's an argument that these men of working age aren't taking up that work because they don't think that's the sort of work that a man like them ought to do.
Yeah.
And so I think there's interesting identity mismatch.
Yeah.
So I distinguish between these sort of frictional issues where there is work but people just can't do it, with a sort of structural technological unemployment, which is where there's just not enough work, full stop.
Yeah.
That even if people could move freely around the labour market, there might not be enough well-paid work to go around.
So some people in the course of this transition are going to prosper, and some people less so, as is the case in all economic situations, I guess.
Yeah.
And you don't dwell on it, but you talk a bit about, because I'm really interested in looking at this, and we've had conversations in the newsroom about artificial intelligence before. It has tended to be about people working within business live now, thinking, or perhaps government and policymakers actually have done quite a lot of work in that space too, thinking what should I be doing now to be ready, both for the opportunities and to insulate from the risks. That tends to be the sort of rubric. But it doesn't tend to be a conversation about inequality as such. So I'd like to unpick the inequality question a little bit more.
I mean, so I think one of the most important arguments I'm trying to make is that it's a mistake to think of technological unemployment as some sort of big problem that looms in the future. Out of sight, in the distance, something we need to think about maybe, but not right now. The argument that I'm making is that actually, it's not a coincidence that today worries about inequality are increasing at exactly the same time as worries about automation are increasing. The two problems are very, very closely related. Again, if we think of the economy as a pie, the traditional way in which we've sliced up the pie, through the market, and in particular through the labour market, both inequality and technological unemployment are signs of dysfunction in that market. Inequality is where some people get far more than others. Technological unemployment is simply where some people get nothing at all. And so I say that technological unemployment is just a more extreme version of the story we already see unfolding today, but one that ends where some people in the market aren't able to get anything for the sorts of skills and capabilities that they're able to bring to bear in the world of work. And so, I say this, isn't a problem. This isn't really a book about the future. It's a book about what's already starting to unfold now.
So who should be worried in the nearer term? Who's most vulnerable?
Those people who do things that these systems and machines are increasingly able to do. And in the 10 years leading up to the turn of the century, in the first decade of the 21st century, it was people who did jobs that involve routine tasks and activities, things that we find easy to articulate, easy to explain. But what's worrying is that these systems and machines are also increasingly doing non-routine tasks and activities as well.
So the people in the room we're all obviously going to be fine. With us being unique, sentient beings that we are. Can I just get a sense of what the people here do for a living? What are your jobs? What fields are you in? And we'll test them out and see if Daniel says we should be anxious, not anxious, and so on and so forth. Who wants to just say what they do? Hello in the back.
I do policy research.
Okay, policy research. Good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah. I'd say it's a trap that I've already fallen into, but a very unhelpful thing that we do when we think about the future of work, and it's one of the things I argue in the book, is that it's very unhelpful to think of the future in terms of jobs. And the reason is because it encourages us to think of the work that people do as a sort of monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff. So what you do is sort of researching. Or what doctors do is doctoring, or what lawyers do is lawyering. Clearly that's not right. If you look under the bonnet of any job, what you see is that all of us perform a huge variety of different tasks and activities. It's the sorts of distinctions that you were making about what it means to do your job, and similarly the sorts of things that you do in your job. Not all of us just do the same thing. Why does that matter? Well, because when we think bottom up in terms of tasks and activities rather than top down in terms of entire jobs, it turns out that almost everyone's job involves lots of tasks and activities that can already be done very differently today, either by different people using technology or without people at all. And it was kind of hammered home. There was a study done in 2017 by McKinsey, and they looked at 820 occupations in the United States, and And what they found was that only 5% of those occupations could be fully automated, given existing technologies, which at a distance looks like technological change. Yeah.
Everyone relax.
Small, really small, 95% of jobs are untouched.
Maybe it's only the accountants anyway.
But then what they did was they also found that 60% of those jobs, 60% of those occupations involved tasks, 30% of which could be automated.
Right.
So the majority of jobs involved a substantial chunk that could be automated. And so that when we think in terms of jobs, and that's just one example of why it's unhelpful.
Yes.
And it's also, it explains why when people say, my job is safe from automation because I do X, where X is something that at the moment we find difficult to automate, like stand up in court and deliver a sort of stunning speech, or come up with a particularly aesthetically pleasing structure or something. My job is safe from automation. It's unhelpful because that's not the only thing you do in your job. You do lots of different tasks and activities, but also, importantly, the tasks and activities involved in those jobs change over time. And the sorts of things that a nurse does today are very different from the sorts of things that they would have done 30 years ago. And again, if we're thinking in terms of jobs, it's too high level, and we miss all this churn and change underneath.
Interesting, thank you. Yes, so what's your name?
Romy.
Hi, Romy.
You say about people don't necessarily have, there's different layers within their job.
Yeah.
I think that's actually the fear, because a lot of management don't see that. So if you're in a big organization, you get pinpointed at your main function of your job, or your job description, for example. And because there's no work done to understand the other layers behind you, in these technological changes, senior management above them will make a decision saying, like, if you look at the trading floor of an investment bank, for example, suddenly there's a whole move to automated trading, when there is a massive skill in being the trader, yet they're not appreciating that, and therefore the management don't take the time to develop those other layers of skills and help them, give them the challenge of saying, how can you progress to the next part of your role? Here's an evolution that's available for you. Can you make that change? Then it's up to the individual to take that step forward. But unfortunately, that's where the mismatch is, and that's because a lot of senior management don't understand what the change is themselves. It's just the fact that the market dictate what happens, and then equally, at the same time, what you're happening is the developing countries are taking on technology so much quicker and at a rate much faster than the developed countries in a way. The cost of employment labor is even cheaper there, so outsourcing is happening at the same time, and what you're seeing, this global system is not really designed for the West, the developed countries, and those people who, yes, they have layers under their jobs, but how can they express that? How can they be given that opportunity to show another set of skills? I think that, for me, is the biggest challenge that we're going to see, and that's where the fear is. And if you look at them, what management do is to stop that, they start fighting against it, and they don't want to make any changes. And then you just end up in these kind of, in paralysis. So that's really where, for me, I look at the challenge, having been at kind of the beginning of one of
That's what I was going to ask, is that from personal experience?
I've just seen that through, I was lucky enough, I was, I guess, at the beginning of a wave of technological improvement, and, there's you walk in, there's a fear that ex-manager looking, oh my God, that's my job, and I'm out in 5-6 years. So there isn't this environment, ecosystem in a lot of these organizations where there is that ability to grow. That's why it takes good management to step up and see beyond that. But that's the challenge.
Yeah, interesting. Tessa?
Yeah, I just think I've got this sorted. So if we look
Brilliant.
if we look at the big tech companies as nations, which we've been doing at Tortoise.
So say a little more, looking at big tech companies
as nations, rather than nation states rather than companies. Back to your point, they're a political entity more than an economic or commercial entity. They should just make us all redundant. They should just pay us a universal basic income and make the entire labour force kind of redundant and get on with it. Because and we'll continue.
So we should just let the big tech companies run the world, is what you're saying?
Absolutely, and we take a universal basic income in exchange and go off and do that pottery class that I've always been wanting to do. Now, I'm being slightly facetious, but there is this element of, if we look at the inequality argument, what is the exchange between these huge organisations? Is it that we have to rethink the price of ourselves and our data in that transaction in a completely different way? And I'm not allowed to ask questions, but there is something about...
You can go up at the end of a sentence.
Do the Australian
high rising terminal.
Yeah. But it's that interaction about what we are as a commodity in this world now, rather than just a labour force as well, that I think is going to change and address that inequality issue. We need to look at ourselves as different commodities in that exchange.
There is certainly something that, and the book talks about it a lot, is if you sort of fast forward, and forgive me for sort of being reductive to get to the point where you say, okay, the big technology companies will become bigger and more powerful politically, more humans will have less to do. So here's a ton of money and power in the big technology companies. Here is really not as much over there. So the value exchange between this and this has to change. And you talk about tax as a means to do. I mean, you mentioned universal basic income or conditional or something, but some of this money is going to have to come over here. Just unpack that a little bit for us, because it's incredibly difficult to get your head around from where we are now to where you get
I should
there.
say, I think the emphasis that you put on fast forward is important, because I don't think the time has come for things like basic income yet. I think the time has come to think seriously about it and test it and explore it, but I don't think that we're there yet. I think the challenge now is, I see the challenge in the world of workers, and it's interesting the work that you're doing, I see it as an educational one. It's fundamentally, how do we give people the skills and capabilities to do the work that's going to be available? So I see the challenge for now as an educational one. So, but if we fast forward, just to go back to the nature of the problem, which is that it's a problem, in my view, this challenge of a world with less work is a challenge of inequality. It's a challenge of how we slice up the pie when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for work, is less effective than it was in the past. So the question in my mind is then, well, what ought to take the place of the labour market? How else are we to share out prosperity in society? And the argument that I make in the book is that we'll need the state to do it. I talk about the big state. And the important point to make there is that I don't see the state, when I say big state, I don't mean the big state of the 20th century. You know, teams of smart people sitting in nice offices in the centre of government trying to command and control entire economic affairs. That's not what I mean. It's not a big state in production, but it's a big state in terms of distribution. You know, the state having more and more of a role in sharing out prosperity in society. And a basic income is, you know, one sort of one tool in the kind of armory that a big state might have. But I think we need to be, if we were to fast forward, the question is, well, how can we use the state to share this material prosperity more widely in society if the labour market does a less effective job than in the past? That's the contour, I think, of the problem.
So what's the... I want to come back to the education
Yes.
point, because there's where we are today,
and
it's incredibly difficult, even just it's a relatively small point you make in the book, but when we think about big tech, we think about the big tech companies that we can see and know about today, that we're investigating at Tortoise, and we've done Apple, and we're going to do Amazon, and you know, all of the, but the chances are it won't be those companies. There'll be a company that doesn't exist yet that will suddenly be there, and I'm eating them all up, and that kind of thing. So trying to envision not just how we get from here to there, but what there is incredibly difficult. And when we talk about learning, education learning, there's a sort of period of time, because there are, you know, children now who will be affected by this. You know, what is the time horizon that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, so I see this. I see the. I mean, I see when I say the challenge is an educational one, I say, well, that's the challenge for the next decade, the challenge for the 2020s. I mean, I don't think you can predict when the nature. You know, I'm really wary of people who say, you know, X% of Y occupations are going to be automated in Z years. I just don't think you can do that. I mean, but what I do think you can do, though, and this is what I argue in the book, is just I think you can make the claim that this is a challenge of decades rather than centuries. It's a challenge for my generation and my daughter's generation.
Right.
That's as kind of predictively accurate as I think you can be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
In a part of the universe last night, there was a similar group of people together debating what to do on education. And
Yes.
lifelong learning actually for the Digitally project.
In here?
No, actually, different forum of academics and I guess one of
different and less good forum. Much less influential.
But one of the conclusions that they came to, however, we came to, was this debate over needing people to engage, and that actually involves critical thinking.
Yeah.
And as an educator, I can say actually we educate adults, but that isn't something that we particularly focus on because people are becoming more focused on the skills that will be needed potentially rather than the mindset, and actually engaging to potentially challenge those new nation states that are technology companies to understand actually that we are potentially commodities and data, and just how disengaged people have come. It was fascinating that it came full circle back to the need for quite broad education of classics and everything else, but how that could be funded and what that meant and how to engage people who don't actually want to keep learning as well, who are quite happy to disengage and not keep learning or feel threatened by it.
Yes, hello. What's your name?
I'm Harriet and I advise on the future of work. I work for Professor Linda Bratton of London Business School, who's been quite a well-known thinker in this space for some time. I think I completely agree that we've got an inequality issue, particularly relating to the education piece. What I would challenge is, as we automate parts of our roles, and much of my work is highly automated, that means that they're then not doing anything. I think it's freeing us up to do other more value-add work. So let me share an example. When I was an intern, aged 22 for a law firm, I put everyone's hours into a massive spreadsheet and told them how many hours they were working. Now my assistant looks at the data that we've entered into our timesheets, which is an app on my phone, and tells us how we ought to be using it better. So she has a more interesting task for my team, which is much more value add and makes us more effective. So I think within the knowledge work space, we're primarily augmenting, and actually my clients are predominantly legal sector and professional services, and I see a lot of augmentation and just individuals being able to do more and more. I think where the challenge lies is within blue-collar work. We've just released as a report with Capital on responsible automation. It's public if you want to take a look at it. And I think there it's more challenging because who's going to pay to build the skill sets or the mindsets or the capabilities of people within blue-collar work? Because we're seeing as many job openings as we are seeing job seekers, if not more, but they just have the wrong skill sets. Or I love the idea of frictional issues around identity mismatch. I completely agree. So I think this inequality will get worse and worse, the gap between blue-collar work and knowledge workers. But I don't see within the knowledge space, I don't see a massive shortening of jobs currently. If anything, I see more popping up, and I think it's a transition. So it's sort of challenge perhaps the fact that jobs are good.
Well, I think we're in agreement. So the effect that you talk about there, I call the sort of economists call it the productivity effect. It's one of the effects that has tended to increase the demand for the work of human beings in the past. That it makes people. Either technology makes people more productive at particular tasks that they currently do, or it frees them up to be more productive at other tasks that they do, or it introduces new tasks. And I think, and I agree that for now, that productivity effect, along with another set of effects that have tended to increase the demand for the work that we all do, are going to continue to be the sort of dominant forces in the world of work. So I think we're in agreement there. But as I look further into the 21st century, I do worry about the strength of that force. Man and machine is only better than machine so long as whatever it is that man's doing in that man and machine combination can't be done by a machine. If you think about what's happened with chess-playing machines, it's a sort of parable of my fear, which is that originally no chess-playing machine could beat a grandmaster. Then a system came along that could beat a grandmaster, but couldn't beat a grandmaster working alongside a machine. So man and machine was better. But now if you look at the latest version of these chess-playing machines, a machine beats a machine plus a human being because the human being's just getting in the way. What we brought to the table in playing chess is now better done by a system and machine. And my fear is that just across the labour market, we're going to see more and more of this. Sat-nav systems make taxi drivers more effective, more productive drivers because they help them navigate unfamiliar roads. But that's only going to be useful for human beings so long as human beings are best placed to be in the driving seat of that taxi. And as soon as machines can do that, then these sat-nav systems will just make human beings more efficient and more effective. I mean, will just make the sort of driverless cars more efficient and more effective. So what's the point I'm making? I think I agree with you that the productivity effect now is important. I worry about its strength as I look further into the 21st century.
I've got lots of people trying to catch my eye, so I'm going to come here, I'm going to go to Lisa, and then I've got a couple of gentlemen over the other side of the room that will come to me in a minute. Hi.
I'm Ian. I don't want to fast forward on this, because if you fast forward, we end up in a fatalistic place, which is a small number of tech companies, everything's automated, they work for everyone else. I think I'm very sympathetic to the arguments about augmentation. So within the company I work for, that's a very clear leadership expectation and guidance to all the workforce that actually digital technology is there to augment our roles, and they will evolve, and there's a responsibility on us as individuals to learn and evolve with that and to sort of change the productivity. So the thing I worry about is who has that responsibility across society? That's the much more critical one. So for those who are fortunate enough to be in workplaces like that, where there's opportunities for growth and learning and evolution, great, but that doesn't describe a lot of the working population. Yeah. So I think when you're talking about the role of the state, Daniel, I'm really much more interested in what's the role of the state in facilitating that learning environment to help people make the transition. Because unless we really purposefully get after that, we will inevitably get up in the fatalistic place. And I don't think. I mean,
so that is, it's a big part of the book. How what the state's role is with respect to giving people the skills and capabilities to do the work that will have to be done. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you feel, Ian, now that with the state as we imagine it today, there is sufficient or the right kind of interest, worry, focus, understanding on that thing?
No, I mean, clearly not. And back to your original question about do I worry, I don't worry unduly, because I think we're better placed now to see what's coming than any generation before us. Yeah. With the benefit of hindsight and history and more data now. So I don't worry for my kids because I know what I'm helping them look out for. Yeah. But I worry more broadly about who is helping everybody. So that goes really to the social justice point of view. That's really where our concerns are.
I think it's fascinating, and actually the Global AI Readiness Index that we published just before Christmas, wasn't it, 4th of December, is a big piece of work that just starts to try and put some kind of comparable rubric on nations' readiness or otherwise, or disposition towards the kind of changes that this sort of technology brings. Lisa?
Two things very quickly. Firstly, my work as a researcher has been massively automated over the past 20 or so years, to my great relief and great increase in productivity. And I'm hoping that AI will be able to do things like literature reviews for me. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the inequality issue. Given how terrible we are at dealing with inequality on a global level, I'm sorry, this is a question, I really apologise. What indicators are there that we will get any better at it? And, in the way, for example, I don't know if you're aware of the Game B community, sort of Game B community.
Be like a buzzing bee.
As just a bee, which I'm not very clear on, and I only know about because with Tortoise we're doing something with, doing a little book with Vinay Gupta. And he's had a run-in with these people who want to change the world for a better place. And
what is it? Sorry, just say what it is.
I'm not 100% sure.
Does anybody know what Game B is?
But it's people who want to change the world by changing the way that the corporate world operates.
Like B Corp.
I don't know. Oh. I don't know. So I've got a very, very superficial understanding, if it's an understanding at all. And they were very keen. They're mostly US-based. They're very keen on changing the world, making the world a better place. And Vinay Gupta went into their Facebook page and said, we can only do this if we have a zero slavery footprint. And apparently they found that very difficult to handle because it was outside their system. So at a situation in a world where we, in a way, have a fairly narrow perspective of what our world is and what it contains, how can we get, I suppose, how can we get better at dealing with inequality, given that it's going to become a much bigger problem than it already is?
I mean, I think an important starting point is the sort of diagnosis of the problem. And I think inequality is on the sort of political agenda now in a way it wasn't a decade ago, I don't think. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book is emphasize that these worries about the future of work and worries about automation are very closely related to these worries about inequality. And so that's how I'm trying to make this something that people respond to. I'm not a politician, but I'm trying to draw attention to a problem that I think is very important and we need to do something about.
Yes, gentleman over there in the glasses.
Leo Rees, I advise on the company.
Sorry, what was your name?
Leo Rees, I advise on the company that's trustful. I guess I'm just quite interested in your sort of view on the inevitability of UBI. I feel like not enough work's really been done to sort of even try to realign capitalism, which is still pretty neoliberal in nature, to sort of meet the demands of technology and where companies are going. I think and where society's going. So I think there's a limited exploration of the social safety net. I think a lot of the capital that's bound up in these companies is still only the privy of an elite that rests in a very small section of private investment that we haven't even tried to unlock for broader value yet. And I guess there's also sort of been an emphasis within the political discourse on protectionism of traditional industries rather than what does security through opening up technology for everyone look like. So I guess for me, I think market forces still have a massive role to play in keeping society sort of fed and watered by technology. I'm not sure that sort of flipping it completely on its head is necessarily the logical sort of next step from where we are.
Okay. And you've been waiting a long time, so sorry. What's your name?
Simon.
Hi, Simon.
And I'm a business anthropologist. I think I'm 39th on the list of tasks or roles, professions least likely to be automated according to Fred Osborne. So I'm pretty.
Sitting pretty there, Simon.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I'm interested by the use of the analogy of chess because I think it's interesting. It always comes up, and I think it's really unhelpful. And I think it's really unhelpful precisely because it's totally the wrong example. Because it's a controlled environment. Chess is a game, controlled environment, perfect information. The world is almost the opposite of chess, and so I think it's a really good example of the way we completely overstate the abilities of AI and machine learning. Level 5 autonomy, by the admission of most of the people that have invested truckloads of billions in it, is a very, 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 very long way away, if it's even possible at all. And the reason is because the world is incredibly messy, and humans, with their tacit and embodied knowledge, are intimately well suited to deal with it. So I suppose there's a challenge there, which is, are we just yet again in a phase where, we're being kind of technologically determinist, we're oversetting the abilities of our devices to do the things that we can do, and to what extent is this kind of another playing out of debates and discussions that have been happening for millennia about how the machines are coming to get us?
Daniel.
Well, I suppose I wrote. I wrote the book because I think that view is wrong, and my starting point, chapter 1 is essentially, what you're saying, and I think it's wrong, and I think it's dangerous because I think we do have a problem. And we need to recognise it, and we need to do something about it. Clearly, chess is a parable, and I caveated it by that, and there are people in AI have moved from chess to saying, okay, let's look at poker. That's got imperfect information. There you don't know what everyone knows. And again, you might say, well, that's... a different way to think about the productivity effect is instead to look at, think about agriculture in the UK. We produce now 5 times what we did in 1864, the 1860s, and yet we require 1/10 of the workers to do it. More than ever before, and yet require 380,000 workers rather than 3.2 million workers to do it. If you were to take any farmer on one of those farms, they are far more productive than they were in the 1860s. And yet, the demand for them is far less than it was. Or think about manufacturing in the UK. Since 1948, we produce several multiples of, I can look at the figures of what we did, and yet we require fewer and fewer people working in manufacturing to do it. Now, the productivity effect is in action there. If you look at any farmer or any worker, any manufacturing factory worker, they're more productive than they ever were in human history, and yet we demand fewer of them. And my worry is, and that's just a limited corner of the economy, but my worry is that these effects might characterize not just particular sectors, but the economy as a whole. And there's no economic law that says that can't be the case. And as technological progress continues to take on more and more tasks and activities, the fear I'm trying to capture in the book is that the sorts of refuges for displaced workers that might have existed in the past may simply no longer, will be far smaller than they were in economic history, and the demand for those tasks and activities may not be enough to provide everyone with well-paid work. So I hear your position, I respect your position, and I begin with it because I think it's really important, but I disagree with it. And I think it's wrong, and I think it's dangerous because I think this is a real problem.
Good to have some tension in a ThinkIn. It's like a proper news
but it's not.
They're being more polite to each other.
But it's not. But it's not something that needs to be, dismissed because it's, what you say is exactly right, and I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. I just worry that it's the wrong conclusion, and this is why we need to talk about these things.
I've got a ton of hands and we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and rattle through as many as I possibly can, starting at that end. Hi, sir. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Tom.
Hi, Tom.
I work in education. For me, as I guess, extent to what we've heard a little bit from all is to me, the journey matters.
Yes.
Right? Like the next, whether it's 10 years or 30 years, that or 50, it doesn't really, that journey matters. And for me, I guess the reason why is for kind of the history of economic growth for thousands of years was enormous wealth concentrated in a tiny number of people, whether that was Egyptian pharaohs, European nobility in the 1700s, or Gilded Age monopolists. But the story of the last 150 years has been enormous growth, but comparatively at least much broader, and the burgeoning middle classes, and a huge number of more people being cut in on that growth. Still clearly people excluded, but comparatively to the preceding millennia, kind of much broader. I guess my worry is, actually, do we start to see a regression? Do we start to see a return to kind of the JP Morgans and the Vanderbilts of 150 years ago? And in so doing, actually, for a huge number of people, they become poorer than their parents. And we start to see an unwinding of this axiom, which has been that every generation has a better quality of life than the preceding one. And I guess that you start to get, when you start that huge concentration again, the power of the state gets under tension, because maybe that is the state, maybe it's not, or the state is unable to challenge those people. So how can you actually cut in more and more people into? Sure, the global economy might double its size in the next 20 years, but most people might not feel that.
Well, exactly, and this is what I'm. So, two observations. One is, I mean, the fear that you're describing, that we might be returning to sort of Gilded Age. If you look at some of the work that Piketty's done, as I'm sure you have, you see that some of the wealth shares are back at where they were in the sorts of moments that you're describing. And that's what I completely agree with you that the transition matters, the journey matters. And that's why I'm trying to that's why I'm trying to make the case that these worries about a world with less work are very closely related to the inequalities that exist today. And that's why we need to do something about them now, because these trends are already starting to trouble and test the way that we live together. And that focusing on a world where robots take all the jobs is unhelpful, in the sense that don't know if that's going to happen. But there's something useful in that, in the sense that I think those worries are very closely related to what's happening now. I think it's very closely related to worries about inequality. I think the two trends are very close. I think it's this sort of very similar phenomenon, and it requires us to start doing something about it now. And so, I mean, I completely agree. Yeah, that economic pie may double over the next 30 years. We solve our traditional economic problem. How do we make it large enough? But it doesn't automatically share itself out. Not everyone automatically gets their $11,000 or $22,000 slice. So I see the challenge in the 21st century more and more as one of distribution, how we share out prosperity, rather than one about growth, about how we make the pie even bigger.
Okay, put your hand nice and clearly in the air so I can see how many people we've got to get through. Okay, another 4. Chap in the hat, hello.
Hi, my name is Balliol and I work in archives.
What's your name again, sorry?
Balliol.
Okay.
As a big tech warrior, I feel like...
Big tech warrior?
Yeah.
Yes, warrior, yeah.
I feel like it is taking up a lot of conversations, and they're important conversations, but sometimes we need to start a conversation from somewhere different. And I've seen a lot of rhetorics that are that people who support universal basic income are against big government, such as Andrew Yang. He's an amazing guy. He puts up a lot of interesting ideas, but at the same time, a lot of opponents of that idea would would want to stop investing in social security nests, and that worries me even more. And I understand that it's very sexy to say it's not immigration, it's automation that is making you lose your job. But in the end of the day, if you look at the statistic, in America more jobs are lost because of bad trade deals than automation right now, and probably that will change. But right now it's the statistics. So how do we address a lot of different issues on the table than just artificial intelligence?
So you're sort of worried that the AI, the conversation around the future of work is too dominated by sort of demonized tech thing, when there's other bogeymen lurking that are equally important or more pressing. Okay, interesting. Daniel.
I mean, I push back a little bit on the claim about the relative importance of trade and automation. It's a lively issue in economics, and in the US, I think it was about 5.6 million US manufacturing jobs were lost in the first decade of the 21st century. I mean, I've seen studies suggesting up to 80% of those were due to automation rather than trade. So I'm not, I think that's right. I might be misquoting the numbers, but the point being there's a tension and disagreement about that. I suppose I'm in agreement in the sense that I don't think the challenge of large technology companies is the only challenge here, but I think it's an important one. I think it's one we need to think about. And I suppose what my worry at the moment is that the way in which we think about the power of large technology companies is a 20th century perspective. We try and bring, economists step up and say big tech is a problem. They bring all the toolkit of competition policy and start talking about things like profit and prices. But I don't think the challenge of large technology companies is primarily an economic one. Increasingly, I think it's a political one. And competition policy doesn't have anything to say about things like liberty and democracy and social justice. And it might sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot, but economists aren't particularly good about talking about these challenges either. And so it worries me that reviews into sort of digital competitiveness and so on in the UK are led by economists, not by political scientists and moral philosophers.
Interesting. Yes, sir. Hi, sorry.
David, I work in corporate learning and development, and recently I've been working with two distinct populations, senior executives and also people just entering the workforce.
Cool.
People just entering the workforce now. So I have two daughters who are both in their mid-20s. And what I find is that at the senior level, executives really struggle with the purpose piece, which is the third part. We haven't discussed much, and I'm curious what you think about that, because all this future of work, this is a big buzzword now. Everyone's going to future of work conferences, and everyone seems worried about it. I think it's more instructive, and that gets me to my daughter's age. People in their 20s are entering the workforce. Is what's my purpose in this new system? Because regardless of if we could replace all ourselves and none of us needed to work, that's not a good outcome. People need a purpose. They need something to do. They need to feel like they're making a contribution. And somehow in all this economic discussion, it feels like that purpose piece sometimes is maybe under-discussed.
It's discussed a lot in the book.
That's why I talk about it in the book, because I think it is. And I suppose, I do two things. One is I really try and look at, I think instinctively many of us think there is a very close relationship between work and meaning. But actually, what I'm trying to do in the book is look more closely at that relationship, because for many people today, work is not a source of meaning at all. Lots of people don't think their work makes a meaningful contribution to the world. Lots of people don't get a sense of meaning and purpose from their work. And if you look back in history, there's been a very different relationship between work and meaning, often the opposite to what we have today. So part of what I'm trying to do is investigate this relationship between work and meaning, and then ask the question, okay, well, if work is an important source of meaning, what do we do? And if it isn't, what else might we do? And I think it opens up a whole world of interesting policy questions and implications that, exactly as you say, I don't think we've started to think enough about.
It seems like the whole emphasis is on, and I have arguments in my family about this, what am I good at? And what can I make money doing? Versus the other two.
The Venn diagram of those two things is
sort of like this Ikigai model. I don't know if you're familiar with this. And the other two parts of that are, what do I love doing and what does the world need? And if I can find the sweet spot between all four of those things, then I've sort of... person.
That's very privileged,
But I feel like that there's such an emphasis on this economic piece and less on
what it means.
What does the world need and what do I love doing?
I'm going to take two more real quick points at the end, and then I'll try and do a wrap up. Hi, Seth. What's your name?
So I'm Alessandro. I'm a PhD at Cass Business School. So very two quick points. So the first one about the idea of growth and just throwing it out there. Of course, there is an environmental problem, and there is a big debate about how do we do with this growth and where we get the resources out there. So not gonna dwell on that, but I think it's a bit of a missing of the debate. But what I'm looking more about in my PhD, it's more about this process of individualization. So my question, my point is very much about, we see like regressions, like disappearance in many European countries, at least in the US as well, about unions, for example. And a big process about individualization and self-responsabilization. There's been quite a lot of big debate about it. So when we look at it, at what happened before in the change of work, there has been gigantic events, for example, in continental Europe, with the role of unions that they're showing some problem that were coming, and they propose solutions. Some people like it, some people no, but of course they were a big social force. Now we don't really see it, even though there is some small movement, for example, in gig economy here in London, in other countries. So what my point out there is very much about that. I think that is a big effect, and technology bring it kind of to the extreme, this individualization. So
and it's in the context of Chris's observation before about the transition being important. One of my worries, J.K. Galbraith, the Economist, talked about the countervailing power. Talked about this idea of countervailing power, the ability to stand up to. Talks about in the 20th century, the ability to stand up to large companies. Large concentrations of economic power. My worry is that the countervailing power of workers at the moment, I think, is on the decline. And if you look at all traditional indicators of labour being able to, whether it's union membership or whatever it is, the direction of travel isn't particularly encouraging. And I think finding ways during this transition of strengthening labour's hand, of giving them a way to respond to the sorts of processes you describe, I think is very important. And I think it's a challenge for traditional unions. I mean, if you look at the way unions organize themselves, they operate using the sort of tools and techniques of the 20th century, not really the 21st. It's very old-fashioned. It's very, and I don't think it's a surprise that membership of unions among young people has fallen so precipitously, because people just don't see them as a modern response to the problems that they face, and I think that needs to change. It's a really interesting bit of work that needs to be done about thinking, well, what does a modern union look like in the 21st century as a response to these changes that are taking place?
I'm going to take one more. George, did you have your hand up at the back? Yeah. The policy. Are you the policy? Sorry.
Yeah, I guess my following the environment question.
Yeah.
How resilient is your kind of forecast future of work to the climate breakdown? All of these developments in machine learning rely on massive data centers that will be more inefficiently cooled as the planet heats. Large, complex global supply chains might be disrupted. Lots of digital infrastructure that again might be disrupted by extreme weather events. So how resilient do you think you're? I think in theory the sort of increasing automation is definitely a true hypothesis, but how resilient is that in practice to all of these effects? I guess.
I mean, I don't think it challenges the direction of travel, but I think it challenges the pace of travel.
I guess
certainly, and I think
centuries.
Sorry. I think I have a line in the book where I say, barring climate catastrophe, this is if climate catastrophe happens, then that's the problem we face.
The robots are going to
not
need to
these,
swim.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. The kind of intersection of the two questions is perhaps something we could unpack in another conversation for sure. I'm very conscious of time, and I know everybody needs to get off and have their Tuesday days. But thank you very much, and thank you obviously to Daniel. As the editor of the conversation, I had to try and kind of wrestle this into some form of shape or conclusion, because we pull out threads from these conversations and try and incorporate them into our existing reporting or begin new reporting on the back of them. And there's definitely some of the elements of this conversation that we can plug into the work that we're doing on artificial intelligence and kind of data privacy, and a new way to make it easier as a consumer to assess that value exchange that Tessa was talking about, which is, if I give you my data, what is it worth to you, and how do I make sure I get a fair exchange from that? And certainly the work we're doing on tech nations and how we're reporting out of the existing tech companies, even though they may not be the big behemoths that we're facing in the future. It's been incredibly helpful to me, not just this morning, but sort of coming out of the back of other conversations we've had about artificial intelligence and indeed the future of work, that my sort of understanding of how we imagine the shift to a world where a more automated environment is normal is sort of, I feel like I've kind of come 10 or 20% on from Terminator 2 in the way that I imagine what that's going to sort of look and feel like, sort of a gentler impact. The picture Daniel painted, and what we think about our jobs as not just the thing that we say we do when your grandma asks you, what do you do, dear? But all of the things that you do underneath that to get you to that point, I think is really helpful in understanding that automation doesn't affect the workforce like this. It kind of affects it like that. And I think that's a really helpful way to see how things might be sort of dismantled. There are three things in particular that I will go away and mull on. I thought David's point talking about looking for meaning and purpose is something that we would like to unpack more. And this idea of there will be work that needs to be done, but it just might not be the kind of work that people imagine themselves doing, and how you get your head around that, particularly who does the caring and the care work. I like the idea of AI as a sort of enforced catalyst to break down some sort of gendered problems that the workforce has been tackling for a while. And this concept that Daniel talks about in the book of a non-economic identity, I actually think is really freeing and interesting as a human race, I guess. Lisa's point here about learning and who is going to pay to adjust the mindset of how we think about education, a shift from skills to critical thinking within education and learning, but perhaps also adopting a kind of a willingness to think critically about education itself and when it happens and who it happens to and how it happens, I think is something that is really interesting, and I will certainly be doing in my Future of Learning series conversations. And thirdly, I think what Ian said, a remark about not fast forwarding, is really important, because after all, we can't really imagine what we're going to be fast forwarding to. So actually, given that a lot of the sort of meat we've discussed this morning does relate to social justice, a lot of that picture is an extrapolation of things that we can see that are real today, in terms of inequality of work, quality of jobs, security, privilege and possibility for people. So I think if, but without getting into a cheery conversation about the rise of political power of the big tech organisations, how we frame the question about who should be worrying about the likely direction of travel that this could take us in, whether or not it will, to Simon's point, aside, we really ought to be asking that question now in the way that probably we should have been asking the climate question 30 years ago, and then maybe we wouldn't find ourselves in the position we are today on that. I think those are three really meaty areas that we've kind of unpicked this morning, but haven't brought to a conclusion. So thank you very much for your articulate and thoughtful contributions. I wish you a very, very happy Tuesday. If you're not yet a member of Tortoise, you aren't allowed to leave until you become one, and my colleague Liv at the back there will take your money from you. Thank you very much. Oh, there's books. If you want to buy a book, also ask Liv, because she's got some there. She's waving her hands in the air. It's a very good read and non-scary. I understood it, so I promise it's good. In the green room. In the green room, yeah.